Hello, good morning. Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to begin. We have some brief general remarks, after which we'll move to our first talk of the day with Mladen Dolar. So we would like to thank the Center for Arts and Humanities and Professor Meher Jarrar in particular, as well as the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, particularly Dean McGreevy, for supporting this event. And we would also like to thank our ex-provost, Ahmed Dalal, whose enthusiastic support for this event early on helped make it possible. Thanks are also due to Rita Basil and Samar Rawas for all their help in organizing transport, accommodation, and other logistics for all our speakers. So a few general remarks on the theme of the conference. So why Lacan contra Foucault? Why Lacan contra Foucault today? And why Lacan contra Foucault in post-war Beirut? In 1989, Slavoj Žižek proposed that the true antagonism at the heart of critical theory was not the then fashionable contrast between Foucault and Habermas, but the unresolved conflict between Althusser and Lacan. Now, 26 years later, amidst the triumphant neoliberal world order, the inspiration for this conference is the conviction that the production of capitalist subjectivity renders it increasingly necessary to oppose Lacan and Foucault. The continuing ascendancy of identity politics, together with its complement of postmodern multiculturalism and the increasing requirement that subjects enjoy their own exploitation, have all made it necessary to spell out the antagonism between Foucault and Lacan. That these two thinkers adopted radically divergent positions on certain pivotal questions is evident from their opposing stances towards the 1968 student rebellions in Paris, from their conflicting interpretations of the function of representation in their discussions of Las Meninas, from their contrasting approaches to sexuality and repression, and from their differing stances towards the question of political ontology. Last but not least, what compounds the incompatibility between Lacan and Foucault is the distance between representation and production that emerges in their work. On the one hand, we have a Foucault who is more interested in the issues of representation and the unveiling of power relations, which are seen by him as decentralized forms of domination. It is these relations that generate the direct production of subjugated subjectivities. In Lacan, on the other hand, this very repression is seen as a form of double production, the production of a surplus object and an alienated subject, of jouissance and a subjection to negativity. So while Foucault dismisses psychoanalysis as a repressive hypothesis, Lacan's rejoinder is that this very position can only be articulated from the position of consciousness. Thus, Lacan introduces the subject of the unconscious, in which desire and language have material consequences that are not necessarily positive, homeostatic, or reproductive of structure. Here we find yet another fundamental divergence between Lacan and Foucault, the divergence between the politics of biopower and the politics of class struggle. Thus, the shadowy third figure lurking in the background of this confrontation is Marx. Given recent systematic readings of Lacan's modifications of Saussurean structuralism, in light of Marx's critique of political economy, and here I refer to the work of Samo Tomczyk in particular, it becomes clear that what is at stake in pitting Lacan against Foucault is the afterlife of structuralism and the theory of the subject, whether of science or of politics. Foucault heralds the advent of post-structuralism, in which the subject, following Nietzsche, is conceived as a product of anonymous forces. The Nietzschean destitution of the subject paves the way for the care of the self with Foucault. Lacan, by way of contrast, retains the emphasis on a laboring subject, irreducible to its imaginary self-identification, a subject that emerges from the gaps and slippages of structure rather than from its consolidation. So this raises another issue, the question of history and of historicism, and of the contrast between historicism and historical materialism, another demarcation that can perhaps be located between Lacan and Foucault. With Lacan, we can see an inscription of the unconscious into politics and the redefinition of the subject as a subjectivized lack, rather than as a lacking subject, and not a subject of the lack. With Foucault's rejection of the psychoanalytic unconscious, we see the destitution of the subject, now reduced to an epiphenomenon of power, and the rehabilitation of the self, now conceived as an aesthetic construct. In the order of things, Foucault tells us that ideology acts as the appearance of representation, which allows for a duplication process whereby all of knowledge is, to quote Foucault here, superimposed upon a representation from whose immediacy one can never escape. This is the end of the quote from Foucault. Kant's critique of reason is seen by Foucault to have sanctioned the withdrawal of thought from the space of representation. Foucault claims that this withdrawal, which culminates in Kant, brought an end to ideology as a classical field and transformed science into a new metaphysics. Thus, the movement of critique for Foucault reinstalls metaphysics in a cyclical manner. It seems that for Foucault, the nature-cultural divide is itself conditioned historically. This cyclicality in critique's secretion of metaphysics is also projected onto language. In the order of things, language itself is seen to emerge from the failures of discourse, the act of speaking, a duplication of representations, and as a form of expression, it is what establishes the link with nature. However, Lacan's famous and infamous claim that the unconscious is structured like language could be seen as pointing beyond the nature-culture divide by already affirming the gray zones and limit zones of subjectivity, of jouissance and of sexuality, as well as the equivocal status of discourse. With psychoanalysis, the fundamental division of mind, body, and nature-culture are converted into the ontogenesis of the body as object, the notion of the signifier, and the parasitical nature of corporeality itself. Foucault's modern subject appears in the vanishing space of the sovereign king as an object of knowledge and as a subject that knows, while Lacan's subject affirms the Kantian destruction of metaphysics and asks how can we uphold language as ontology in a way that perceives of language not simply as an organon for description, but as having real material consequences. So these brief but not very brief preliminary remarks are an attempt to elaborate a little on the three basic points of divergence which we have identified between these two thinkers: the question of universalism, the nature of the subject, and the meaning of politics. We have suggested that this divergence can ultimately be traced back to Lacan and Foucault's respective stances towards Enlightenment thought and towards the Kantian compact between autonomy, reason, and freedom. We are delighted to have with us such a distinguished array of speakers to help us engage with these questions, and we're very much looking forward to all the conversations that we will have over the next 3 days, as well as the publication, hopefully, of a conference proceedings in an edited volume in the not too distant future. So thank you all for being here, and without further ado, I think Ray will introduce Mladen for the first talk. Thank you.
Okay, please. Very pleased to welcome our first speaker for this conference, Mladen Dolar, who's a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Ljubljana. Mladen is well known for his, important work on Lacan and Hegel in particular. He co-authored Opera's Second Death with Slavoj Žižek in 2001, and published A Voice and Nothing More, which has been an extremely influential book with MIT in 2006. Mladen is currently, he has a new book forthcoming called The Riskiest Moment with Duke University Press, and he also has a work on avarice forthcoming with Verso, which will discuss, amongst other things, the nature of the debt drive. So without further ado, Mladen's paper today is entitled Cutting Off the King's Head.
Well, thank you very much, Ray, and thank you first for the invitation and for organizing this in this place which seems particularly apposite, Lebanon being famous for a long history of civil wars. So here we have another one, Lacan versus Foucault. I mean, the announcement of this staging this conflict in Lebanon of all places. There's a twist in this. So my paper will map out some territory, make some very general points about the confrontation of Foucault with psychoanalysis. And I will take it has basically two parts. First, considering the nature of power, and then considering his take on psychoanalysis, and trying to come to some sort of very general alternative with which I think Foucault is faced through both these strands of thought. So, cutting off the king's head. This is a quote from Foucault in a famous interview in 1977. He stated, "It is necessary to cut off the king's head. In political theory, this hasn't happened yet." So this slogan-like pronouncement is perhaps best suited to summarize Foucault's endeavors, at least one of his crucial points. For these endeavors took a very tortuous road through a vast number of different areas, his oeuvre stretching over decades and often changing positions, expanding and rich and detailed accounts, engaging both in great theoretical breakthroughs and in political struggles in the same breath, spelling out vast patterns and ramifications that cannot but inspire awe and admiration. So this is, I think this will be partly the tenure of many speakers, the big awe and admiration we have for Foucault, while at the same time having all kinds of critical misgivings about the nature of his project. So my starting point might appear meager in relation to this, yet I think it addresses a central point, or one of its central points. Now, if we try to spell out the assumptions on which this slogan is premised, we could say this. One could cut off the king's head in the revolutionary enthusiasm 200 years back. But the inveterate assumption which saw in the king's head the bearer and the center of power survived the guillotine. What didn't lose its head by cutting off the king's head was the general view that understood power in terms of sovereignty, law, prohibition, and repression. And as Foucault said in the same interview, and I'm giving a bit longer quote, which is typical of many places where Foucault speaks of this, the sovereign, law, prohibition, all these formed a system of representation of power which was promoted in the next period by legal theories. Political theory never ceased to be obsessed with the person of the sovereign. Such theories, even today, continue to deal with the problem of sovereignty. But what we need is a political theory that wouldn't be built on the problem of sovereignty and therefore not around the problem of law and prohibition. If the effects of power are defined as repression, we assume an entirely legal concept of power. Power is identified with the law that says no, regarded in the first place as a force of prohibition. This is, in my view, an entirely negative, narrow, rough concept of power, but which is incredibly widespread. If power was merely repressive, if it didn't do anything else except saying no, do you believe that anyone would obey it? The reason that power is doing well and it is accepted is the simple fact that it doesn't weigh on us with the simple force of no, but that it traverses bodies, produces things, arouses pleasures, informs knowledge, produces discourse. Rather than a negative instance whose function is repression, it should be envisaged as a productive network which runs through the entire social body. So let this quote stand for so many developments that are spread throughout Foucault's work. And they said what he's stating here is set in harsh opposition to the predominant dogmas of political theories, and in particular left-wing dogmas of the time, which couldn't abandon the ways of seeing the power as repressive in one way or another, in the function of a sovereign, of the ruling class, of the law, of the state. Now, Foucault's enormous effort against this prevailing view was to present power as a new object of thought, something that has been obfuscated in virtually all political theories. First of all, power is not a place, it's not a definable location, a locus in the social which could be limited to a particular site. And this was the classical and the most common illusion, to see the power situated in a particular person or a particular group of people or social class or in a privileged institution of the state. The power could then be seen as emanating from this point downwards. It could display a pyramidal structure. And the ensuing natural counter-strategy was to endeavor to get hold of this particular locus at the top in order to exercise power in turn, or to ultimately try to eliminate it, to abolish the state along with the class domination. According to this seemingly self-evident view, the power is something that can be possessed by somebody and exercised from this privileged point. And at an even more rudimentary level, power is irreducible for Foucault to either violence or law. The two entities are both opposed, the rule of law being supposedly the end of the rule of violence, and implicated in each other, for the law takes its support in violence by assigning a monopoly over it to certain institutions. If power presents a problem, it is insofar it cannot be reduced either to physical coercion or to the legal repression. I quote, "Power is exercised only over free subjects, and only so far as they are free. Slavery is not a power relation. A man who is chained up and beaten is subject to force being exerted over him, not power. But if he can be induced to speak, preferring death, then he has been caused to behave in a certain way. His freedom has been subjected to power." So I'm just taking this quote because there you have Foucault, who is an archi-anti-Hegelian, actually proposing the very minimal mechanism of power as the choice between freedom and death, and basically rewriting a certain, in his own way, the Hegelian script of master and slave. So coercion is not power, and neither can power be reduced to the law as the foundation of society, its basic contract that holds it together and provides legitimacy for its distribution of power, nor to particular forms of legality brought about by specific procedures of consensus and participation. The legal or juridical part of the story may be important, but it's not the conceptual place from which to seize power. Furthermore, power cannot be reduced to something more fundamental lying behind it, and of which it would be but a mask, like the economic sphere, productive forces, and relation of production. It is not an epiphenomenon or a superstructure whose basis would be somewhere else. There is no hidden depth of power. It is all on the surface, and what is on the surface is all there is to it. Neither can it be reduced to an origin, transcendent or natural, from which it would derive and which would endow it with authority. There is nothing behind power, and power is always already there, supported only by itself. And with this argument, which is very briefly summarized, oversimplified, Foucault discarded virtually all the classical and common approaches to power and the bulk of standard political theories, as failing to account for this new object, a number of diverse effects and mechanisms. And the key concepts of sovereignty, legitimacy, state are not the foundations they claim to be, but they are involved into strategies of power which don't stem from them, but enclose, comprehend, and incorporate them. One could say that those entities do have an existence, whereas power does not. It permits and constantly displaces them. And hence, Foucault's famous proclamation in another interview, power doesn't exist. Le pouvoir, ça n'existe pas. But those discarded entities, sovereignty, state, the law, etc., had one thing in common. They all made a certain totality out of the social. They made it into a whole. Taking those entities as a starting point, one could delimit the social and consider it as a totality, as well as discern its underlying power structure. Whereas for Foucault, and this is the first important consequence, power doesn't form a totality, it doesn't totalize. It rather makes the social a non-whole, something that cannot be delimited. If those entities formed the totality, it was always by a certain logic of exclusion and external division. One excluded the sovereign from the social as a transcending point. One excluded the law as a symbolic foundation of authority, opposed to the social texture it founded. One divided the social into opposing spheres. Foucault's step, on the other hand, is based on the logic of inclusion. There is no outside of power, and if it operates by constant divisions, those divisions are internal to it. Or more precisely, the division into internal and external is thereby made superfluous. So power has no exteriority, and it is therefore by its nature non-totalizable. Nor does it have an essence or an interiority, and this is why the what question, what is power, has to be replaced by a how question. How does power work? Power is neither a substance nor a subject, Hegelianly speaking, neither an agency nor a place, and it is ultimately not a concept at all, insofar as a concept presupposes an order totality. As non-totalizable, it is actually ultimately non-conceptualizable. It has a paradoxical status of a non-concept. Power is not one. And this produces a side effect that Foucault has to constantly multiply its attributes. So this is Foucault's general vocabulary. Proliferation, multiplicity, dispersion, prolixity, inciting, enhancement, diversification, production, fermentation, heterogeneity, innumerable. And many of these attributes tend to always appear in plural. So this is an external mark and consequence of the radical stance that power is a non-concept, not a concept of one. It has many names because it is, strictly speaking, unnameable. Another way is to see this as a process of immanentization. Any transcendent entity has become a moment of an inner deployment. And if power can have totalizing effects, those are to be seen as divergent processes of totalization, as opposed to totality, processes that cannot reach their end or stabilize themselves. Processes of permanently shifting borders, always partial, unstable, and constantly undermined. And Deleuze, who tried to summarize Foucault's position in his book on Foucault, has this particularly succinct slogan: one, totality, truth, object, subject are not universals. And this is precisely the moment of divergence, but singular processes of unification, totalization, verification, objectification, subjectifications, processes which are immanent to certain dispositives. End of quote. Now, a further consequence of the pure exteriority of power is that Foucault discards the whole line of thinking which was common to so many approaches to power, that one envisions power in terms of ideology and consciousness. The problem of the type of consciousness that makes possible power relations, its inherent illusions, its essential blinding, the false consciousness which enraptures the individuals and turns them into subjects, the intertwining of recognition and miscognition, those problems do not arise for Foucault at all, for they would entail, in the widest sense, a space of interiority and mechanism of repression, the entities he's trying to do away with. To be sure, there is a constant problem of how a disciplinary program is to be translated into subjective conduct, but the problem has to be solved without ever recurring to the ideological representations and the traditional themes of consciousness. This is why the problem of the subject, once it explicitly arises in Foucault's later work, is posed in entirely different terms, the terms of practices of self-relation, the practical self-production of the self rather than a universality of subjectivity, self-reflection, or the notion of a subject as possible bearer of a universality. Care for the self, which figures in the title of his last book, is not a type of consciousness but a type of practice. And most importantly, it's not something external to power, opposing some realm of interiority or the psychic to the power relations, but rather a relation of power to itself, a power bending on itself, as it were, an internal loop of power. An internal loop to be conceived as at the very opposite end in relation to the self-reflexive turn of the classical self-consciousness or any self-referentiality, it's self-referentiality devoid of self-reflexivity, as it were. So this is why the Foucauldian subject cannot be accounted for either in its imaginary form, for it doesn't emerge in the dialectics of recognition and miscognition, nor in its symbolic form, for it is in no way reducible to the function of a lack. Neither ego nor the barred subject. This is also why Foucault avoids the notion of desire and proposes to replace it by an analysis based on bodies and pleasures. Desire, for him, implies a negative ontology, an ontology of a lack, and of an object supposedly detained by the other, an object which would be able to fill this lack. Pleasure instead of desire, body instead of castration, the positivity of event instead of the lack, the multiplicity of power relations instead of sovereignty. But the nature of power is what, this nature of power, is what constitutes the advent of modernity. There is an essential discontinuity, a rupture, that has shaped the fate of power and which inaugurated our era. This is what Foucault tries to pinpoint on all different levels throughout his work. The exclusion of the mad with le grand raffermement, as opposed to their liberation framed by new disciplinary techniques. The spectacle of public punishment as opposed to incarceration. The power that displays itself as opposed to the power that controls. The dispositive of alliance as opposed to the dispositive sexuality. The power which takes, the goods, ultimately one's life, as opposed to the power which produces and enhances the biopower that promulgates life. In each of those instances, there is a shift from a negative functioning of the law to the positive and immanent deployment of a norm. From the law as a restriction to the norm as a progressive incorporation and constant proliferation, from exclusion to inclusion. The norm is now seen to be immanent to and constitutive of the field of its application. Its supposed restrictiveness constitutes what it is supposed to repress. It doesn't negate or repress something external to it, but it presents the moment of its inner condition of possibility. It doesn't restrict something which was already there before, but rather brings it about. And the whole work of, there's a very good work of Pierre Macheret, which explores the history of the advent of the norm. And the whole issue of governmentality, the subject of Foucault's scrupulous reflection in his later period, aims precisely at this point of dissociation between sovereignty and legality on the one hand and the pervasive power mechanisms on the other. What is at stake is a power aiming at the disposition of things, a multiform tactics, which has a finality of its own beyond issues of law and sovereignty. The new techniques of governing, enhancing and controlling populations, statistical methods, calculation of risk. The emergence of the reason of state, la raison d'etat, and its curious new logic, along with the emergence of the new entity, the police in the 17th century sense of the word, are two most marked signals of a modality of power which has moved well beyond the framework of sovereignty and law into an area of immanent enhancement and deployment. So the paradoxical non-totalizable nature of power only becomes fully deployed with the disciplinary society. Most of the political theories remain stuck with the notions of the sovereignty and legality, so the novelty of disciplinary mechanisms couldn't be fully understood, and thus it was unable to account for most important ways in which modern power is exercised. As Foucault put it, this is one formulation of this, maybe what is really important for our modernity is not so much the etatization of society as the governmentalization of the state. So the state itself being hostage to the different strategies of power rather than being a locus of power. So here is this, briefly summarized, his enormous endeavor to think power as an object which hasn't been thought before. And if there is a negative aspect to Foucault's theory of power, establishing what power is not, and this side is to be seen as a step towards establishing the power in its positivity. Indeed, the point of rejecting the traditional approaches was precisely an attempt to think the power in its pure as a purely positive force, since to posit the power in terms of sovereignty and law was to take it basically as a power which says no. The point of Foucault's famous critique of repressive hypothesis was to reverse the perspective and to envision power as production, inducement, enhancement, and increase, rather than negation, exclusion, or limitation. So the negative side of Foucault's theory aimed precisely at discarding the negativity that the traditional theories introduce as pertaining to the very nature of power. The real difficulty emerges with thinking the power as positive. Foucault is telling a story which is suspended between two poles. There once was an era of sovereignty, and after the break, without our quite taking stock of it, it has turned into something very different. I will take just one quote. This is from Discipline and Punish. "The body of the king, with his strange material and physical presence, with the force that he himself deploys or transmits to some few others, is at the opposite extreme of this new physics of power, a physics of a relational and multiple power, which has its maximum intensity not in the person of the king, but in the bodies that can be individualized by these relations." So, this story is entirely premised on this massive opposition. The break between the body of the king, the pre-modern forms of power, and its modern variety. Although one shouldn't be prey to the illusion of a great break and should scrutinize the heterogeneous multiplicity of micro-discontinuities, is what he insists on. But perhaps the constant evoking of heterogeneity and multiplicity rather obfuscates the break that has been presupposed from the outset. Did sovereignty, so necessary to this narrative, ever exist in this proposed form? And, okay, I will not go into this, but Agamben's criticism is precisely that sovereignty was always already based on biopolitics. And what we are witnessing now as biopolitics is its obverse side, not its demise, not its other. And politically, this also implies a question I will not go into, but the multiplicity of struggles that Foucault promotes, as opposed to reducing the struggle to one big antagonism of the class struggle as the defining contradiction, versus the diversity of agonisms on different kind of levels, or what many have formulated in Foucault's steps as micropolitics. Is it enough for a political struggle? Is it enough for a political struggle to espouse this multiplicity of agonisms? Is it enough, is it symptomatic to give up the very question of universality? To ultimately see, and this is true for many Foucauldians rather than Foucault, that also for Foucault, that the universal, every universal, is seen as the terror of the universal. And doesn't this alternative preclude the struggle for the universal as the very terrain of political struggles? And finally, at the bottom of it, and I will come to this at the end, I don't know, to put it in the most possible naive way, is multiplicity good? Is one bad as such? Perhaps the multiple and heterogeneous stories and levels that form the texture of power are based not on one, but on a disavowed one, which hasn't been done away with nor conceptualized, but disavowed, and tends to revenge itself posthumously. Is the rejection of one, and hence of universality, and the espousal of the ontology of multiplicity and heterogeneity the only possible outcome and move after we have cut off the king's head? And I will just mention that, okay, I will not go into this any length, the question of, symptomatic question of the status of one in panopticon. The panopticon, which is kind of a rule of one, a central fantasy ruling over the microphysics of bodies, languages, pleasures, and so many different institutions as a sort of regulative one, which subtends this diversity of different of the whole deployment of this disciplinary society. And I quote just one quote from Foucault: "If I had wanted to describe real life in prisons, I wouldn't indeed have gone to Bentham." So this is not a description of what actually happened in the 19th century disciplinary society. But the fact that this real life isn't the same thing as the theoretician's schemas doesn't entail that these schemas are therefore utopian and imaginary. One could only think that if one had a very impoverished notion of the real. So what is the status of panopticon? It's not a description of what really went on. It's not the ideal type which would be opposed to which would oppose the purity of the ideal and the disorderly impurity of the real. And neither is it the difference between illusion and reality. It is rather a part of fiction that is necessary to account for reality itself, or to bring about a certain reality. It is a non-lieu, this is Foucault's word, a fiction that produces very real effects. And Foucault says, "Is it surprising that the prison resembles the factories, schools, army barracks, hospitals, which all resemble prisons?" Well, maybe it is surprising. It is indeed surprising. If the multiplicity of dispersed and heterogeneous micro-relations converges into this single image of power and its fictitious regulative one. So, a kind of naive objection could be that Foucault's strategy of dispersed macro-relations eventually converges into a pattern of power where the one, the master, the king, may well be absent, replaced by architecture and geometry, reduced to pure function and fiction, yet his empty place makes its presence all the more pervasive and intractable. Okay, I'm coming to my second part, which is the relation of Foucault to psychoanalysis. And as you know, this is not a story with a happy ending. Foucault was engaging with psychoanalysis throughout his life, to the point that the whole project of history of sexuality started as a settling of accounts with, or indeed a crusade against psychoanalysis, a vast proposal of a different account of sexuality than what he saw as the generally accepted psychoanalytic account. The story started already with the first text that Foucault ever published, with his lengthy introduction to the French translation of Binswanger's Dream and Existence in 1954. And at the outset, one should perhaps mention the massive fact, namely that Foucault, who is supposed to be this meticulous reader of archives, the scrupulous researcher of forgotten texts and authors, throughout his lifelong engagement with psychoanalysis, never ever quotes Freud himself, nor Lacan for that matter. So in my own archival research, if it is correct, then there is a single exception. The last time that Foucault ever quoted Freud was in the first text that he published in 1954, where he briefly quoted from Freud's analysis of Schreber and Dora, and then never again. His typical pronouncements take the form of psychoanalysis maintains that, this or that, without a single attempt to substantialize the statements with some textual support. So this fact is rather staggering and strangely symptomatic. And the first consequence to be drawn is that Foucault engages with psychoanalysis on the level of doxa, on the level of the received opinion, of the ways that psychoanalysis figures in the zeitgeist, never on the level of episteme and knowledge. The whole criticism, and very harsh criticism it is waged against what the opponent supposedly, really, ultimately wanted to say, without ever seriously considering what he actually said. As if the opponent, if he was given the word, would only lead us astray as to what is really at stake, as if in the fear he would gain a misleading advantage. If history of sexuality is an attempt of archaeology or a genealogy of psychoanalysis, then this is an archaeology singularly devoid of any statements. And you know that Foucault's insistence in Archéologie du savoir, archaeology of knowledge, was precisely that statements, les énoncés, this is the basis of any possible archaeology. Now, to be sure, opinions are not to be discarded lightly. They shape the ways of perception, and they can be highly symptomatic of the thing itself. The vulgata pertaining to some disavowed aspects of theory brought to earth and made practical, not merely the noble cause wasted on ignorant folk. But then this would demand a different kind of analysis. It couldn't be spared doing the other half of the job, namely to conceptually show what was wrong with the theory if it could be watered down to this kind of opinion and stereotype. But Foucault never even tried to engage with psychoanalytic theory, as if he was haunted by the ghost of its massive presence in the doxa of the 60s and the 70s. And he blatantly impugned so many views to his opponents that neither Freud nor Lacan would ever dream of espousing. Now, the only major exception is actually the first text, the introduction to Binswanger in 1954, where Foucault argues for the status of the image, and image particularly in dreams, a morphology of imaginary space that escapes psychoanalysis in its obsession with the hermeneutics of meaning, its endeavor to excavate hidden meanings beyond the image. Its major fault is the privileged place assigned to language, so that the image is merely a cover of language, I quote, and language is supposed to spell out its truth. There is a surplus of image over meaning that would constitute like the authentic experience of otherness. And Freud always reduced the dream to the spoken account of the dream, to its linguistic expression. So Foucault tried to pave his way, as pinpointed already by Binswanger, between two dangers. One presented by psychoanalysis in its search for hidden sense to be spelled out by language. And he says image is, in this account, just a less transparent word. And on the other hand, phenomenology, which seeks to constitute the image in terms of expressive intentionality, thus turning it into a hostage of interiority. Neither the one nor the other are true to the experience of the image, and both reduce its alterity. Well, this was his his entry into the whole problem of engagement with psychoanalysis, his initial thing that he wanted to defend. And of course, already in this initial attempt, there is a major misunderstanding of what is at stake. For to see in psychoanalysis the hermeneutics of the hidden meaning, hermeneutics of the self, to use Foucault's ulterior formulation, is precisely to miss what is at stake with the unconscious. And here is the major problem. Foucault's whole polemics with psychoanalysis completely circumvents the problem of the unconscious. It is not mentioned one single time in the history of sexuality, and his ulterior work, he pinned his argument entirely on the notion of sexuality. Now, in the history of madness, the indictment against psychoanalysis is expanded, more extensive and harsher. I quote, Freud has endowed the doctor with all the structures that Pinel and Duke have instituted within the asylum. It is true that he has liberated the patient of his confinement to the asylum, where his liberators have incarcerated him, but he hasn't liberated him from what was essential in this. He redistributed its forces and expanded them to the maximum so that he assembled them in doctor's hands. He created the analytical situation in which, in a short circuit of genius, alienation becomes disalienation, since through the doctor it becomes the subject. End of quote. So, on this account, psychoanalysis would preserve the inveterate core of authority. It transformed everything else except for this core. The asylum brought to the gist the authority of judgment over madness, rather than entering the dangerous domain where madness would present a judgment over us. the modern psychiatrist secretly gathers in his hands, and this goes for the analyst as well, the authorities of the father, the judge, the law, the order, and psychoanalysis presents its most insidious and subtle, the most subtle avatar of this. It has retained the magical, mystical basis of the authority of what he calls the thaumaturge, the maker of miracles. Well, this is the harsh indictment at the end of the book, but at the same time, and Derrida has patiently followed this trajectory in his text to do justice to Freud, Freud is throughout the book also placed on the other side, the one to institute a dialogue with madness instead of classifying and objectifying it, the one who is often listed alongside with the great madmen like Nerval, Hölderlin, Nietzsche, Van Gogh, and Artaud. There seems to be like a good Freud and a bad Freud. Or the question is rather, is psychoanalysis precisely to be placed on this edge, the strange intersection of clinical reason and of the other of reason? Why didn't Foucault at any point actually attempt to engage with this obvious contradiction which runs through his book? Now I'm doing a very quick overview of his various engagements in psychoanalysis. So in Le Mot et la Chose, in the Order of Discourse in 1966, we are very surprised to learn at the end of the book that the very fault, the fatal flaw that served as the basis of condemnation in a few years earlier in the history of madness is actually the major lever that enables psychoanalysis to confront the advent of modernity. If transference is the psychoanalytic name for the alleged authority of the analyst, the clue to the mechanism of authority and its deconstruction in analysis, then the most promising and lucid point of psychoanalysis is now seen precisely in transference. And I quote, this is Foucault in 1966, "Neither hypnosis nor the alienation of the patient in the phantasmatic personality of the doctor are constitutive for psychoanalysis. But it can nevertheless only be deployed in the calm violence of a singular relationship and of transference which it calls for. Psychoanalysis uses the singular relationship of transference to discover at the extreme limits of representation the desire, the law, the death, which mark at the extremity of analytical language and practice the particular figures of finitude. Nothing is more alien to psychoanalysis than some general theory of man or anthropology. Not only it can do very well without the notion of man, it cannot do with it at all, since it always addresses what constitutes his outer borders." End of quote. So, now we see that here psychoanalysis is the harbinger of the death of man, of this most notorious slogan of the book, which at the time came to epitomize the very stance of structuralism. Psychoanalysis is praised for its confronting desire, law, and death as the figures of finitude. And, well, one could say now it is praised. Before it was completely condemned. Now it is greatly praised, but for all the wrong reasons, I think. What is highly symptomatic in this is the symptomatic oscillation of Foucault in relation to it. The harsh rejection virtually coexisting with the enthusiastic espousal, without any transition, as if there was some unresolved, intractable, affective kernel, which pushed him either in one direction or the other, as something intractable that never allowed for the impassive view of the archaeologist. Something is there in psychoanalysis which went either in this very harsh rejection or the praise. Then, with the first volume of the History of Sexuality in 1976, this tortuous journey reached its final stage where sexuality emerged at the same time with the concept of biopolitics, and thus sexuality, together with psychoanalysis, was treated as the vintage case of a biopolitical dispositive. If psychoanalysis treated sexuality as an ahistorical phenomenon pertaining to human nature, as it were, then Foucault's major point is to show that sexuality is something that was historically produced at a certain period. Its invention coincided with the advent of modernity and the rise of bourgeoisie. The new dispositive of sexuality, not based on its repression, as one might surmise, but on its incitement and proliferation of discourses, emerged in opposition with the prior pre-modern dispositive of alliance, based on kinship, family, blood relations, the social hierarchies based on them as the core. But there lies the fatal flaw of psychoanalysis, and this is one major argument of Foucault. I just read this brief passage. Psychoanalysis, which by its technical procedures seem to locate sexuality outside of the family sovereignty, has found again at the very core of sexuality, as the principle of its formation and the cipher of its intelligibility, the law of alliance, the interplay of marriage and kinship, the incest, the guarantee that at the basis of everyone's sexuality we will find the relation parents-children, has made it possible to retain the attachment of the dispositive sexuality to the dispositive of alliance, precisely at the moment when everything pointed to the inverse process. With psychoanalysis, sexuality gives body and life to the rules of alliance by filling them with desire. End of quote. So, the discovery of psychoanalysis would thus ultimately be that the truth of sexuality as the new dispositive lies in the old model of alliance, with the figure of the father, family, Oedipus, law, and desire. Desire now only figuring as the obverse side of the law, chained to the Oedipal scenario. It is like a repetition of the story told in the history of madness, ultimately saving the pre-modern authority behind the modern outlook. The great mistake of the political theory, which when faced with the new models of power could only see sovereignty as its true mover and swore by the juridic model of the law, has its striking counterpart in the great error of psychoanalysis, which keeps reducing, in an analogous way, sexuality to the antiquated figures of paternal authority and law, finding them at the very core of intimacy. What the political theory is doing at the level of society, psychoanalysis accomplishes at the level of the individual and the psychic. Briefly, it hasn't cut off the king's head, but continues to see in the father's head, the truth of sex and desire. And even worse, it turned even the cutting off of the king's head into the problem of castration as the law of desire. Speaking of king's head, on the last page of the book, sexuality is literally placed into the realm of monarchy. I quote, "We need to consider the possibility that one day, perhaps in a different economy of bodies and pleasures, people will no longer quite understand how the ruses of sexuality and the power that sustains its organization were able to subject us to the great austere monarchy of sex, so that we became dedicated to the endless task of forcing its secret, of exacting the truest of confessions from the shadow." The irony of this dispositive, it wants to make us believe that this is the matter of our liberation. This is the ending of the book. So, okay, if I'm simplifying and drawing this very large picture, the monarchy of sex, the monarchy of king, the monarchy of the father, the monarchy of meaning, the monarchy of the one, they all sustain each other. The inveterate persistence of regressive conviction that cannot come to terms with the new plurality, heterogeneity, dispersion, proliferation of practices, dispositives, and discourses. The quasi-atavistic belief that one doesn't want to see the new object that Foucault supersensitely displays for us and keeps being blindly fixed on the king's head. Now to take just briefly take just one point of this indictment. Does psychoanalysis present the re-emergence of the authority of the father, and thus the alliance the authority of the alliance, or the model of the alliance versus the new dispositive sexuality. And as I have argued already elsewhere, I think it is rather that Freud discerned the function of the father and its vicissitudes precisely at a time when the traditional account has historically lost its way and envisaged its historic transformation. And to be sure, of course, Freud proposed the myth of the murder of the father, of the dead father acquiring more force than the living, ruling as the name of the father, as a symbolic authority of the symbolic. But one could say that with the advent of modernity, and this precisely the cutting off the king's head, what Freud saw in this is that it was the dead father himself who actually died. He lost the symbolic impact. His name stopped being the foundation of authority. It was revealed as an imposture. Fathers, both real and symbolic, lost their power, which could then be retroactively seen as tainted with imposture from the outset. So these massive historic presuppositions made it possible for Freud to discern the father not as a source of authority, as a natural, religious, or symbolic authority, but in the contingency of his function. It was not that any father or ruler or god could no longer measure up to this function, but rather that the symbolic function itself lost the power of a measure. And there are many ways and vocabularies to describe this ascent of modernity, and one economical way is this: the dead father, the reference point of symbolic authority, has met his demise. But it would be premature to the outburst of joy at this demise of authority would be premature, for what comes after the overthrow of kings and the decline of this symbolic authority is not some new spread of proliferation of multiplicities, but rather the rise of the underside of the symbolic father, and for which the psychoanalytic name is the superego. The superego, whose rule is more intractable or far more difficult to cope with. The patriarchal rule was bad enough, but what we are facing, what we are faced with after its demise is even worse. In the structure of the superego, one can detect the traits of what, for instance, Foucault describes as the norm versus the law. Not any longer the prohibition of enjoyment is precisely the function of a superego, but the injunction to enjoy. And this is Lacan's formula of the superego. So proliferation and enhancement, including the production of new discourses on sexuality in its truth, couldn't these lines of reflection be considered precisely as analogous to what Foucault keeps describing? Freud is not quite the harbinger of the law and the father behind the sexual dispositive, nor the harbinger of a newly liberated sexuality. His harsh criticism of restrictive morality never spilled into the praise for its liberation. It is rather that sexuality, finally freed from its traditional bonds, is another way of obfuscating what is at stake in it. So if Freud was skeptical, then precisely because of the new link of sexuality, not with the law that prohibits and takes, but precisely with the superegoic injunction, the new function, the underside which came to the fore. Now to come to the conclusion. Does one have to cut off the king's head? How to cut off the king's head? Is psychoanalysis, together with the bulk of political theories, the last venerator of monarchy? Is our ingrained fixation on the king's head what prevents emancipation? Now, biopolitics and sexuality are for Foucault two connected dispositives that define the ground after the demise of the old sovereignty. And the chances of revolt and invention demand that we cease to see old models under the guise of the new ones. But isn't this picture perhaps a bit too clear-cut, and assumes an opposition that Foucault never ceases to reiterate under ever new forms. So at the bottom there is this alternative, either the monarchy of sex desire or plurality of bodies and pleasures, either the framework of sovereignty or the heterogeneous dispositives, multiple strategies, governmentality, either the rule of one or the dispersion of multiplicity, proliferation and production. This seems to be Foucault's very fundamental ontological stance, and the variety of analysis seems to reiterate and come back to this ineluctable alternative. The same goes for the alternative between the negativity implied in the power that says no, as well as the prohibitions weighing on sexuality and repression, with the father's no at the bottom, and the positive account of proliferation and productivity. Now, my whole point, and I'm actually at the end come to the task that needs to be done in far more detail, there's something missing in this alternative. Is this alternative a matter of decision and choice? And it is beyond this alternative that the problems in psychoanalysis really start, in particular the problems with sexuality. First, the espousal of multiplicity and heterogeneity is rather a way to escape from the paradoxes of one. Okay, I can evoke economically the title of Lorenzo Chiesa's forthcoming book, which is Not One. The title is Not One. Not one is not the multiple. It involves the question of a split that is not a split into the one and the multiple. A split one, whose other side is rather something that doesn't simply exist and proliferate as a positive entity, but insists in its impossibility. Hence, all Lacan's formulas proposing a non-existence. The other doesn't exist. The woman doesn't exist. The woman as the other sex doesn't exist. But this non-existence doesn't amount to a zero or simple absence. And hence, second, the problem of sexuality constantly haunted by the problem of sexual difference. A difference which is not a split of one, nor the dual binary relation, nor the proliferation of multiplicity of sexual positions, identities, whatever practices, beyond the imposed matrix of the two. But something, not even something, that insists as real, traversing the utopian fantasy of bodies and pleasures, beyond the supposed monarchy of sex. It is by showing fidelity to this real, the real of this split, that psychoanalysis could never be squeezed into the model of alliance, law, family, father, nor would it ever espouse the biopolitical dispositive of sexuality. Its problem only emerges if we reject this alternative. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Madden. So we have now a good 25 minutes for questions. Okay, for Josh. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. On one,
We have a microphone. Which
Yes, maybe there's a bit struggle with hearing.
The switch. Is there? Yeah.
you don't have a microphone.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
About the one. Badiou says the one is not, and if I understand you correctly, transference seems to transfer onto the one and make it exist, even though, as in the case of power, say, the one doesn't exist, or the other doesn't exist, or a woman doesn't exist. Or in the problem of reading, even of reading Foucault, say, circa 1966, I find that your reading, the interpretation, and this will get us into a vicious circle, right? We'll always be doing psychoanalytic readings of Foucault, reading Lacan, reading Freud. So let me just give an example of what I'm talking about. So you say there's a good Freud in Foucault and a bad Freud. There is a praise of Freud, and then there is a blame of Freud, right? So this sounds very much like our old friend, Melanie Klein's good, bad breast, right? You'll always have this alternative. And your conclusion, and I didn't quite process the stuff leading towards the conclusion, but the conclusion stressed we should try to get beyond good, bad alternatives, right? So the one is not, and this relates not to multiplicities, but I have a specific question about 1966. Namely, I don't think he is praising Freud at all. As mentioned, who he really praises, who he praises to the skies, is, of course, Sartre, Lacan, Artaud, right? And I'm very surprised that people can even pretend to read Foucault, Lacan, Derrida without having read, i.e. being violated by Artaud or Maldoror. And so he says in the 1790s, Sartre lets desire flow over the body of the text and makes everything interpretable, right? This whole vicious circle of interpretability. So these names are so deeply invested for him. Bataille, Sartre, yada, yada, yada. So I just wonder if you could address this specific interpretive problem about 1966, that he's not really making Freud into a praise or a blame, but rather praising to the heights literature, interpretation. And this brings us back to this whole problem of interpreting the signifier, interpreting Foucault again, without the whole problem of interpretation, which is, of course, Derrida, right?
Yes, well, thank you. Yes. You finished. Okay, yeah. I think the end of the Le Moy les choses is highly symptomatic in Foucault's, in the whole of Foucault's position. There is no way of going away that he is making a case for transference, as I quoted this key passage, as confronting, as psychoanalytic way of confronting desire, death, and finitude, which is precisely the way that he finishes the book. I mean, the psychoanalysis is one of the major cases in the fate of the demise of man, the end of man, having no anthropology, no positive. So it's one of the major cases that contribute to this sort of the end point of the book. But what you specifically are asking about, the question of the praise of literature and Bataille and Artaud and many others, at the end of Le Moy les choses, and I've just for this paper now reread the whole thing, he makes a double argument. There's the argument for the formalization, for the absolute necessity of formalization, and for the informal of the literature, the non-form, the beyond the form of literature. And formalization, this is one of the few spots that he speaks about the unconscious, and I quote, the unconscious as well possesses, or better, is a certain formal structure. And he sees this as in line with, there's a praise for Lévi-Strauss for anthropology, in a praise for the formalization imposed by linguistics precisely at the high point of structuralism. And his argument is a double argument. We need this. We need formalization and the unconscious seen within the realm of formalization, as it were, not as a romantic beyond transgression or whatever. As well as we need the completely informal proposed by literature, such literature as Bataille and Artaud. It's a double thing, but there are two strategies which are both absolutely necessary. This is what he argues for at the end of Le Moy les choses. This is not what he normally argued for. I mean, I think this is rather exceptional that at the end of Le Moy les choses he came to this double thing. We need both parts.
Rohan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin, for your talk. It was extraordinary. I have a clarificatory question, largely, which is on this notion of the difference between prohibition and order for Foucault, which confuses me quite a bit, and Lacan's understanding of prohibition and his understanding of order with respect to jouissance in particular. So it seems like what Lacan's saying with the university discourse is that the imperative to enjoy is not about what Dostoevsky standing was saying, like if God is dead, everything is permitted. It's actually the opposite. It's if God is dead, everything is ordered, managed, as Sam was arguing in his book. But then how does that understanding of order and management of jouissance with regards to Lacan relate to Foucault's understanding of order with respect to Levi-Strauss and the anthropologist Durkheim's understandings of order as producing power as opposed to prohibition, if that makes any sense?
Well, I'm not sure that they're speaking of the same thing. I mean, Lacan and Foucault.
Very
Yeah. I think in Foucault you have order. I mean, I don't know if order is the key point that he actually wants to speak about. It's rather that if we see power as the power of prohibition and basically premised on on a negativity, then we have this proliferation, which is, well, this great productive thing beyond repression, which is a double-edged thing. It's both the power of ordering and of new ways of domination beyond this misleading picture of great productivity, and at the same time, it's our best bet for the revolt against this. I mean, this is what Foucault was constantly reproached with. Like, if you describe this all-encompassing power, which proliferates, but its own proliferation is constantly recuperated by ever new forms of domination, where is the position for revolt at all? And I think that it's always the very thing that enables the proliferation of power is also the thing that can work against it. It's our only bet to work against it. There is no outside of power. And this is how he then conceives subjectivity as the inner loop of power, not something that would present a certain point, taking a certain point which could somehow get us out of the power relations, but rather it's only inside of power that we can use its own productivity against its ordering, as it were. So the ordering is sort of a symptom of productivity productivity gone astray, as it were. The productivity which...
so it's not the cause of productivity, it's the effect of
Yeah.
productivity.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me. Thank you.
Yes.
To go back to the end of the first part, which is on the prison, do you make a distinction between three terms which are the function, the form, and the diagram? Because the function would be more on the side of the one, because it's definable and it's we can determine it as an identity, be it as a functional, as a mathematical function, or as a determination. While the form can never be as good as a function. For example, a mathematical function, if you want to realize it in a form, the form will be always known. Okay, so the multiplicity on that level is the diagram, because it deals with a relation of power between the elements that are supposed to be under the function. So this is why I don't see how this diagram could become the one of the fiction again, because it seems to me that the fiction is the function and not the diagram. So when Foucault says that there is something common between a school, a prison, and etc., he's referring to the diagram, to the diagrammatic relations, rather than to the fiction of, let's say, productivity, education, etc. So I don't see how the diagram can become again the one that is a fiction, because it doesn't have a specific form, or it's not a function. You see what I mean?
Absolutely. The quote I gave is of course about the diagram, the status of the diagram.
Yeah.
Yes. No, of course. And my only question was, what exactly is the status of this diagram? In the relation between the one and the multiple. What exactly is the status of this? If you look at the panoptical diagram, isn't the most striking thing that it's actually a diagram of unification rather than a diagram of diversification?
When you say it's a diagram of unification, it's as if the diagram now has a definable function, which is to bring together all the parts under an identity. While what Foucault is, at least is how I understand him, what he's saying is that under the function, which is, let's say, to punish or to educate, there is immanent power relation that is happening in the space organization, which is, for example, to be seen and not to see and not to be seen. Now, this to see and not to be seen cannot be a function of unification. It's happening with and under the unity, which is to educate. Do you see where the difference is?
Well,
if we take the function to educate, you can do it in a school, you can do it under a tree, you can do it in an atelier, you can do it in many spatial forms. So, which means that the diagram is changing, even though the function is remaining the same, the unifying aspect.
No, but what you describe is like what is changed, the unity, would be then pertaining to education. This would be what would constitute the unity, wherever you do it. This is not the question I've been trying to address at all. I mean, why is the diagram equally applicable in all these different places? Whether you want to educate, whether you want to punish, whether you want to produce in a factory. So there is the status of a diagram which somehow can find its realization for very different functions, but which has a kind of status of a central fantasy. Central fantasy precisely being structured around the cut between seeing and being seen, which institutes a certain relation to the center of power. This is a sort of
realized through this diagrammatic organization, but technically speaking, doesn't mean that now the diagram is a unity. This is where I'm not. If it's one diagram, it doesn't mean that it's a unity, because unity, I understand it as an identifiable, definable function.
yes. Maybe we disagree about the question of unity exactly. Yeah. Of course, Foucault wouldn't say this is a unity of a diagram which can be applicable in all these different cases. I just think that what really he does in his analysis is something like this. It's a disavowal of a certain unity of a diagram which holds the whole thing together. That this is the sort of the revenge of the one, where there shouldn't be one.
He uses unity in the productive failure at the end of Surveiller. He says that it's actually because we cannot realize the unity, which is, let's say, the perfect prism. This is the unity, the ideal prism. That the prism is able to expand by multiplying its diagrammatic formula.
Yes, but I'm...
So, sorry, it seems like this might be a question that's better addressed in the break, which we will have a very short one indeed. Are there any other questions? Yes,
Lorenzo.
Thank you, Mladen. The question will not be on Lacan, but on Foucault. Stranger than that. You talked about this, you touched in the first part of the paper about this complex idea of periodization in terms of paradigms of power in Foucault. And I wanted to ask you a bit more because I'm myself puzzled by Foucault at times. So let's say very generally that you have like sovereign paradigm, power and biopower. You said you spoke, I don't know if you were referring to Foucault or just commenting me about micro discontinuities in terms of paradigm.
Yes.
And then you referred, of course, to Agamben's critique of Foucault, which I totally agree can be summed up as sovereignty and biopower have gone hand in hand since at least Roman times, if not ontological Aristotle. This is Agamben's point. But then the point is, do you think there is really one Foucault position on the connection between one paradigm of power, i.e. sovereignty, and biopower? Because I think there are at least two, or I will try to rephrase it. I think that if we ended up with Agamben and Negri, so the two opposite spectra of Foucaultianism in these terms of periodizations of paradigm powers, I think you can find both in Foucault himself. So my question would be, do you think, is Agamben betraying Foucault more than Negri? Is Negri betraying Foucault more than Agamben? Or are both Negri and Foucault, so the two total opposite approach, are both Negri and Agamben as the two totally opposite approach to this question of the relation between biopower and sovereignty, actually very Foucaultian indeed, because these tensions are already present within Foucault?
Well, yes. No, I would tend to agree with you. Yes, but I wasn't going to the whole length of describing the various ways in which Foucault deals with the break. I mean, my only point was that there is a break. I mean, there is a Foucauldian basic position. The basic presupposition he starts from is there is a break. There is a break which divides history into two, is it there? There was a history of one, and there was a history of the multiple.
But that would be more Negrian in a sense. But then you have to deal with Nazism in Foucault terms, right? Which looks much more Agambenian in a way. I mean, there is a break, but at the same time, it was not really a break, and that's why I was fascinated by this idea of micro discontinuity you mentioned.
Yes, you know? Yes. But this is Foucault's own way of describing this. If you look at Jean-Claude Miller, I mean, he would constantly insist on, like, there is not a real break in Foucault. If you think there is a break in Foucault, then you get it wrong. There are micro discontinuities. He actually wants to decompose the very notion of the break. Well, I think there is a disavowal of a break. If you take this position, there's a disavowal that you actually always presuppose there is a big break. You somehow construct your argument around, and then you say, but actually there was no break. Actually, there was only micro discontinuities, and I think both things are true of Foucault. Yes.
Maybe we've got time for one more question, Robert.
Oh, yes, thank you for that paper. I am wondering whether you think Foucault's concept of power is ultimately useful. In other words, it's clear that there is such a thing, and that it encompasses all four Lacanian discourses minus the unconscious, and that it is the entirety of Foucault's theory of intersubjectivity. And you could describe all of these intersubjective influences on agency as power. My question is why?
Well, I would first reply with, like in your own words, minus the unconscious. maybe minus the unconscious is I mean, this can be very slight. I mean, minus the unconscious, but it actually makes for, I think, a dramatic opposition in the end. And yes, of course, as I started off by saying, I have great admiration for Foucault, and I think he really forced us to think power as a new object and in new terms. I would go a long way with many of his analyses. They're brilliant, actually. And there is just this thing: where exactly do we place the question of negativity and one? And I think he has a certain myth of the negativity and one, that against which he works, but it's a myth. And psychoanalysis precisely tries to think ontologically what exactly is implied in one and negativity. And if you try to think this, then you are able to escape this alternative, either this massive one of totalization, etc., or espousing the heterogeneous multiplicity. And this was the only thing I tried to somehow insist on at the end. But yes, I would go a very long way with many Foucauldian analysis, of course.
Okay, there's one. I think we have time for Nikolai at.
Thank you so much for your paper. I have a quick question. We're constantly going back to this idea of a concept of power, which slightly troubles me, and you kind of make it a little bit more problematic for us to think in terms of a concept of power for Foucault, especially because he talks always in plural terms. So there's no one concept of power. There's no general theory of power. There's always an analytics of power. So why do we go back? And I heard you going back also to questions of the nature of power, which is equally problematic in a way because there's no ontology of power. You're constantly saying that. So why not use the concept of practices, which was so central for him? That in a way what we're seeing are practices, and yes, some of those practices are underlined by microphysics of power and by relations of power. So why do we go back to, I'm just curious because I hear all this discussion about sort of why are we trying so hard to do something against Foucault? Foucault was never really trying to give us a universal. And I think the methodological principle that he really gives us in the introduction of the birth of biopolitics is so clear. He says, I don't want to think through universals. I want to constantly go back to practices and never even try to reach the level of the universal. So just out of curiosity, why do we go back to the concept of power? Because I think there is no such thing in Foucault. Thank you.
No, but this is the first thing I try to argue for. There is no such thing as a concept of power in Foucault. This is an unconcept. It's precisely the non-totalizable nature of effects which are everywhere, but it has no outside. Why are we going back to the concept of power? Because Foucault was obsessed with it. I mean, a large part of his work is a certain deconstruction of the very notion of power as something unitary. And the third thing, the most important thing you said at the end, there are no universals. No? We start from practices. And this is the point, precisely the point of divergence. Can we have a notion of, let's look at the practices, there's Foucault's nominalism, his nominalist stance. Let's look at the particular practices and what follows from there, and various series they form or whatever. But there can be no universal. There can be no universal. And I think that the opposite strategy I try to propose is the strategy which tries to think together the three entities which are prohibited for Foucault, which are prescribed by Foucault, which are the entities of one, negativity, and the universal. And I think that this is the real dividing line. This is where I think psychoanalysis stands for all those three things. Thinking through the paradoxes of the one which wouldn't be the one of totality and the one of sovereignty, the one of totalization. Thinking through the negativity which pertains to this kind of sort of one, as it were, pertains to a sort of foundational crack, without which the very notion of sexuality cannot be thought in Freud, and which again establishes a certain possibility of the universal, the fight for universal, as opposed to the multiplicity of heterogeneous practices that we have to somehow figure out. These are, I think, the three conceptual dividing points between Foucault and psychoanalysis.
Okay, now I think this would be a good place to stop, and thanks again, Mladen, for a fantastic talk. So we have time for a 10-minute, well, just 10-minute break, and then start back.
Give us a cigarette break.
Yeah, sure. Perhaps it's time we move on to the second panel. lest we be further delayed according to our schedule. Yes. It's my great honor to introduce to you the second speaker for this conference, Johanna Oksala, who is an Academy of Finland Research Fellow in the Department of Philosophy, History, Culture, and Art Studies at the University of Helsinki, in addition to being a visiting professor in the Departments of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research in the USA. Johanna is a great Foucault expert, beginning with a book on Foucault on freedom, and continuing with an introductory handbook on how to read Foucault. Moving on to Foucault, Politics and Violence, also an introductory handbook to political philosophy, All That Matters. And finally, with a book forthcoming in 2016, in January 2016, that is, on feminist experiences, Foucauldian and phenomenological investigations. Please welcome Johanna, who will be speaking to us today about capitalist forms of subjectivity, Foucault between psychoanalysis and Marxism.
Thanks a lot. I also want to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's really exciting to be here, and I look forward to discussing this topic with you for the next few days. My paper is really a kind of a contribution from the Foucauldian side, so we'll see how this goes. Commentators' assessments of Foucault's relationship to Marxism on the one hand and to psychoanalysis on the other have been very similar in the sense that he never simply criticizes or appropriates them. Rather, his philosophical trajectory is marked with the permanent struggle with them. Etienne Balibar, for example, notes that such a struggle with Marx accounts for the complex combinations of antagonistic positions, close affinities, refutations, and borrowings in his works. Joel Whitebooks writes in a similar vein that the consideration of Foucault's work, quote, indicates the intensely conflicted and complex nature of his relationship to psychoanalysis, unquote. The aim of my paper is to examine this struggle with Marxism and psychoanalysis and to show how it underlies Foucault's breakthrough in political philosophy, namely his account of productive power and the concomitant understanding of the subject. However, I will also attempt to show how he moves significantly beyond these frameworks towards an original analysis, particularly in his lectures on governmentality. My inquiry proceeds in 3 stages. In the first section, I examine how Foucault's critique of psychoanalysis in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, is significantly modified in a lecture delivered in Brazil around the same time called The Mesh of Power. In this lecture, Foucault notably develops his account of productive power in dialogue with Lacan and Marx. In the second section, I will briefly discuss the account of the docile subject that emerges from discipline and punish as a response to Althusser. And in the third section, I will turn to Foucault's account of Homo economicus as the interface between the subject and power in the Birth of Biopolitics lectures. I will conclude that these lectures represent Foucault's most developed attempt to theorize specifically capitalist forms of subjectivity. So the first section. Thinkers from Alexandra Kollontai to Judith Butler have famously argued that Marxism has struggled to theorize sexuality. The common accusation is that orthodox Marxists have been openly hostile to sexual issues as manifestations of bourgeois indulgence and as distractions from the real issues of class politics. The Marxist attempts to confront the issue of sexuality by turning to psychoanalysis for help, such as the work of Reich and Marcuse, are the key target of Foucault's devastating critique in The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Foucault's central argument, the refutation of what he terms the repressive hypothesis, appears as a blanket nullification of the importance of psychoanalysis for any critical political analysis of the significance of sexuality. According to Foucault, psychoanalysis assumes a permanent and universal structure or mechanism through which societal power represses sexual desire. Its fundamental mistake lies in believing that there is an oppositional relationship between sex and power, and that quote, by saying yes to sex, one says no to power. Foucault shows that rather than being outside and opposed to power, sexuality is produced by power through the deployment of sexuality to serve the ends of biopolitics, essentially normalization. So while psychoanalysis traces sexuality to sources inherent to the subject, the instinctual unconscious life of the individual, for Foucault, sexuality was constructed by external material conditions, the deployment of sexuality. Instead of attempting to liberate our sexuality, we must attack its deployment. In The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Foucault thus subsumes psychoanalysis under the normalizing practices that extended from pastoral power to the apparatus to sexuality. So psychoanalysis is viewed as another disciplinary practice of confession that aims to adjust the patient to the norms and behavior of respectable bourgeois life. As White Book sums up Foucault's condemning view, quote, bourgeois normality, in short, is equated with psychic health. The idea that our sex harbors what is most true in ourselves is essentially a ruse of power. There's nothing liberating in turning away from social reality to the inner realm of the psyche. Moreover, the analyst's position is that of a doctor father, a detached, authoritarian, and purely objective judge, and the relationship between the analyst and the analysand is essentially always an asymmetrical power relation between a normal and healthy expert and a sick and abnormal patient. In a lecture titled The Mesh of Power and delivered in 1976, around the same time as The History of Sexuality Volume 1 was published, Foucault gives a more nuanced account of what is at stake in his antagonism to psychoanalysis, however. He begins the lecture by noting that he's not the first thinker who attempts to skirt around the Freudian schema that pits instinct against repression and culture. And he now refers explicitly to Lacan as one of the thinkers who has tried to show that repression, far from being a secondary mechanism attempting to control a given or natural play of instinct, in fact constitutes an essential mechanism in the process through which the instinct develops and unfolds as a drive. In other words, Foucault acknowledges that in the Lacanian version, sexuality should not be understood as a simple natural given, a biological mechanism that is consequently repressed by cultural prohibition. Rather, it should be understood as already profoundly constituted by repression. It is the outcome of a complex play between the body and the law, the body and the cultural mechanisms that are aimed at the control and the normalization of sexuality. Foucault commends this development and sees it as a recognition that the relationship between power and sexuality cannot be understood simply in terms of repression, but implies a more complex intertwinement. However, for him, Lacanian psychoanalysis does not go far enough in its attempt to rethink the relationship between repression and sexuality. He writes, quote, "They have perhaps altered the concept of desire, but they have in no way altered our concept of power," unquote. In other words, despite his innovations in theorizing sexuality, Lacan still continued to regard power negatively. It was something that prohibited and repressed. And Foucault's original contribution, in contrast, was to insist that to really rethink sexuality, we had to rethink power. Hence the famous call to cut off the head of the king. Quote, We must now free ourselves from this juridical conception of power derived from the law and the sovereign rule and prohibition if we want to proceed towards an analysis of the real functioning of power rather than its mere representation. Unquote. In this lecture, Foucault then goes on to sketch his account of productive power based essentially on the idea that power should be understood and analyzed as specific technologies or practices of power. He suggests that we can already find in certain political treatises the fundamental elements for such an analysis, and he gives us two examples. First, the work of Jeremy Bentham, whom he calls the great theoretician of bourgeois power, and whose model for an ideal prison, Panopticon, had provided the central illustration of the mechanisms of productive power in Discipline and Punishment. And second, Marx's Capital, in which, quote, we may find some elements of what I will use for the analysis of power in its positive mechanisms, unquote. In this lecture, Foucault suggests that while Lacan had pointed him in the right direction, it was now Marx who could take him further in rethinking not just sexuality, but power itself. So against the dominant theoreticians of power and sexuality of his time, Marcuse and Reich, Foucault thus attempts to, in a sense, develop his own critical synthesis of psychoanalysis and Marxism. Foucault identifies four crucial insights concerning productive power that he claims to find in Capital. First, society is not a unitary body in which only one kind of power is exercised, but an archipelago of different powers that maintain their specificity. Quote, Marx places great emphasis, for example, on the simultaneously specific and relatively autonomous character of de facto power of the de facto power the boss exercises in a workshop compared to the juridical kind of power that exists in the rest of the society. Unquote. Second, these different webs or forms of power cannot be understood as the derivation or the consequence of some central and overriding sovereign power that would be primary. Marx does not recognize the theoretical schema put forward by social contract theorists, for example, but shows, quote, on the contrary, how starting from the initial and primitive existence of these small regions of power, like property, slavery, workshop, and also the army, little by little, the great state apparatuses were able to form, unquote. Third, these specific or regional powers do not have the function of prohibition. Their essential function instead is to produce, quote, the efficiency and skill of the producers of the product, unquote. Fourth, power should be theorized as historically specific techniques that were invented, developed, and perfected. Quote, here, once again, we can easily find between the lines of the second volume of Capital an analysis which would be the history of the technology of power, such as it was exercised in the workhouses and factories. So, in this lecture, Foucault defends a kind of an alternative political reading of Marx that emphasizes that capitalism is not merely a mode of production relying on economic exploitation and expropriation, but a specific political organization that relies on distinctive relations of power. He reads Marx himself as a post-Marxist who already recognized the recognized the diffuse and heterogeneous nature of power, as well as the constitutive relationship it has to the subject. For him, the Marxists who regard power as a juridical superstructure are in fact reinscribing Marx in the bourgeois and juridical theory of power. They Rousseauify Marx. As Pierre Macheret notes in his reading of this lecture, Foucault saw that academic Marxism fell headlong into the trap of taking literally the discourse of power elaborated by bourgeois society. Power appears as a superstructure whose orders come down from high. quote, in reality these orders ascend bottom up from the depths of the system where value is produced, quote. And Marx helped us to understand that in this sense power is economic before being political, or both economic and political at the same time, particularly in those passages in which he analyzes the mechanisms through which capital disciplines and exerts its authority over laborers so as to increase productivity. While private political and economic powers were united in the hands of the feudal lord, for example, in capitalism it is the autonomous laws of the economy which exercise economic power, not the individual capitalist maliciously imposing his personal authority upon the laborers. Yet, what these autonomous laws allow the capitalist to do is to exercise an unprecedented degree of control, not only over production, but this is an interesting development because I can't actually see the paper very well now.
It'll take 2 minutes. Then just
Okay, it will come back.
It'll come back.
Okay, good. Okay, let's have a break and think about this.
Or I can hold this.
Okay, we can also.
We can just wait 1 minute.
Okay, let's wait. Let me just show me the light so that I can finish this sentence because this is actually the end of the first section of my paper. So. Okay, so the last sentence. What these autonomous laws allow the capitalists to do is to exercise an unprecedented degree of control, not only over production, but all aspects of the workers' lives. End of the first section. So I think this is pretty good timing. Okay. Okay, great. That was less dramatic than it could have been. Okay, so I'm going to move to the second section after this break. So, Foucault's reading of Marx in this lecture, in a sense, comes close to such theorists as Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, who have argued that through the idea of real subsumption, Marx already was able to theorize how power relations were constitutive of the subjects embedded in them. By real subsumption, Marx referred to the way in which capital not only takes over and manages an already existing labor process, but completely transforms its nature and, by extension, the laborers themselves. So, according to Marx, capitalist production truly begins, quote, only when the subjection of labor to capital becomes real rather than simply formal. That is, when this subjection actually transforms the labor process itself, unquote. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault clearly continues the Marxist critique of liberalism by showing how the supposedly free political subject of liberalism was in fact materially constructed through the concrete and detailed disciplinary practices of production. He contends that the establishment of a formally egalitarian juridical framework and the organization of a parliamentary political system was accompanied by the development and generalization of disciplinary mechanisms. They constituted, quote, the other dark side of these processes of democratic progress, unquote. He also makes explicitly the argument that the birth of disciplinary power could only be understood in connection with the development of capitalism, quote. The growth of a capitalist economy gave rise to the specific modality of disciplinary power, whose general formulas, techniques of submitting forces and bodies, in short political anatomy, could be operated in the most diverse political regimes, apparatuses and institutions, unquote. In an interview from 1978, Foucault also explicitly confirms the idea that his work is a continuation of Marx's genealogy of capitalism, in a sense that he too is engaged in a historically concrete analysis of the conditions for the development of capitalism. Quote, I situate my work in the lineage of the second book of Capital. For instance, what I wrote on discipline, my work is intrinsically linked to what Marx writes. Unquote. So, should we then simply conclude that Foucault's theory of productive power and his analysis of subjectivization are in fact a relatively straightforward appropriation of Marx? Well, no. Whilst we should not underestimate Marx's influence on Foucault, it's nevertheless important to recognize the novelty of his account and the ways in which he radically departs from Marxist attempts to theorize specifically capitalist forms of subjectivity. First, Foucault strongly rejects any explanatory power attributed to ideology. The idea that we can place between people their natural dispositions and the historical forms within which these are exploited an intermediate layer occupied by ideal representations. From Foucault's perspective, the Althusserian theory of the ideological interpellation of individuals into subjects, for example, is not just inadequate, but based on a mistaken idea of power, the subject, and their relationship. For Althusser, the key question was how capitalism reproduces the relations of production themselves, the capitalist relations of exploitation. So it was not enough to understand how capitalism was able to reproduce labor power in a sense of nurturing a new generation of workers with a specific set of skills. It also had to reproduce the workers' submission to the rules of the established order. According to him, this was achieved through the ideological state apparatuses, a body of institutions such as religious and educational institutions, the family, the media, which unlike the police or the military, for example, did not operate primarily through violence and repression, but through ideology. So Althusser already recognized that power had both repressive as well as productive aspects. And for him, Foucault's disciplinary institutions, such as schools and hospitals, even prisons to the extent that they are understood primarily as corrective rather than merely punitive, would function as ideological state apparatuses in which ideology was realized. To understand Foucault's critique of ideology correctly, it's important to make clear that Althusser does not advocate a naive notion of ideology according to which it consists of a set of useful lies invented by the elite for the explicit purpose of brainwashing and controlling the workers. Rather, his claim is that individuals always already live in an ideology. In other words, quote, in a determinate representation of the world whose imaginary distortion depends on their imaginary relations to their conditions of existence, unquote. Ideas and representations are always already inscribed in actions which become intelligible only as parts of social practices and rituals. This means that ideology in its Althusserian version does not consist of some abstract and spiritual realm of ideas, but is always material in a sense that it is essentially embedded in an apparatus and its practice. For him, ideology is nevertheless transhistorical. Its formal structure is always the same. Althusser compares it explicitly to Freud's theory of the unconscious. Quote, it is omnipresent in its immutable forms throughout history, unquote. In a 1972 interview, Foucault outlines clearly his main difficulties with the concept of ideology, meaning his difficulties with Althusser. He criticizes the fact that, quote, ideology stands in a secondary position relative to something which functions as its infrastructure, as its material economic determinant, unquote. The second problem, and this is more relevant for my topic, the second problem is that quote, the concept of ideology refers to something of the order of a subject, unquote. The subject Foucault refers to here is the proletariat, as the epistemically and politically privileged subject of world history. At this point, Foucault nevertheless seems to accept the basic tenet of psychoanalysis underlying the Althusserlian account of interpellation, that forms of subjectivity are not adopted through reflexive and voluntary consent. However, he dispenses completely with the idea of an ideological molding of the psyche and focuses on the body instead. Disciplinary power is importantly theorized as a form of power that is capable of guiding behavior without ever appearing to consciousness as its governing principle. Foucault's famous phrase, in Discipline and Punish, soul is the prison of the body, is precisely an attempt to argue that discipline is not an order or injunction descending from the soul into the body. Rather, discipline is established foremost at the level of the body through a process of trial and error. It relies on strategies which, as far as their functioning is concerned, do not obey any deterministic finality that could be consciously understood. The order established following this type of procedure is therefore binding, but exerts its constraints more smoothly, insidiously, and precisely because it incorporates itself into the bodies of the subjects. The norms become embodied as their second nature. Foucault's rejection of the notion of ideology also implies, importantly, a rejection of the distinction between ideology and science. Subjectification is always inherently tied to scientific knowledge and the effects of scientific truths. In the third lecture of the lecture series, Security, Territory, Population, Foucault makes an eliminative distinction. He distinguishes between what he calls normation and normalization. These are awkward concepts, but I think the idea behind them is useful. He explains that normation begins with the norm as a prescriptive ideal, an optimal that is constructed in terms of a certain desired result. Discipline in factories, for example, breaks down individuals, places, times, movements, actions, and operations so that they can then be coercively modified according to the objectives of capital, such as greater efficiency and docility. In contrast, normalization, what Foucault calls in the strict sense, requires knowledge of the normal, understood as a scientific average that can be represented through a bell curve. Quote, the normal comes first and the norm is deduced from it, unquote. So, while normation could thus be understood to correspond relatively neatly with the idea of real subsumption in capital, normalization introduces an aspect of subjectivization that Marxist accounts struggle to explain with the notion of ideology. The normal has become essentially a scientific measure. And normalization or subjectivization is therefore a process that produces numerous other intersecting forms of the subject besides docile laborers. It involves large-scale techniques of governing, always linked with games of truth and forms of scientific knowledge. Okay, I will move to the third and final section. Foucault's most developed account of the specifically capitalist form of subjectivity can be found in his lectures on governmentality that trace the birth of Homo economicus as the necessary correlate of liberal governmentality. In Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Foucault introduced and outlined his account of productive power in specific contexts, namely in connection with sexuality and penal institutions. The exemplary forms of capitalist subjectivity under study were thus either docile workers and delinquents, or the bourgeois subjects of various sexual neuroses. In the lectures on governmentality, he's no longer concerned with the hidden aspects of power behind the progressive facade of liberalism. He now analyzes liberalism itself as a form of governmentality. When liberalism is theorized as a distinct rationality of government, freedom is the essential correlate of the deployment of its specific techniques. Liberal governmentality can only function on the condition that there's freedom in the sense of the possibility for circulation of both people and things. Foucault thus returns to a critique of liberalism in these lectures, but now from a new angle. He questions whether individual freedom was ever the aim of liberalism and suggests that freedom was better understood as an instrument or medium of the political control of the population. Hence, liberalism is not an ideology of freedom, it is above all a technology of power. In the lecture series Security, Territory, Population and the Birth of Biopolitics, government becomes Foucault's preferred term for power, while governmentality functions as his main theoretical tool for analyzing its historically specific rationalities, techniques, and procedures in modernity. Quote, I have proposed to call governmentality the way in which one conducts the conduct of men, a proposed analytical grid for relations of power, unquote. In the lectures, The Birth of Biopolitics, the focus is explicitly on the birth of liberal and neoliberal governmentality, forms of political rationality concerned with the government of the modern capitalist state. Foucault proposes that the neoliberal governmentality challenged the ideal and the project of an exhaustive disciplinary society in which the legal network hemming in individuals was taken over and extended internally by normative mechanisms. His lectures on liberalism and neoliberalism can thus be read as a form of self-critique. While disciplinary power had provided Foucault with a useful tool for elucidating some of the key mechanisms in the constitution of the subject still operative in our society, it was proving to be inadequate for understanding many others. As he notes, quote, what we call discipline is only one aspect of the art of governing people in our society, unquote. He was now concerned about the rise of neoliberal forms of governmentality, characterizing his own historical milieu, and the lectures should be read as a response to these concerns. Foucault's key claim is that the birth of liberal governmentality necessitated the birth of Homo economicus, the specifically capitalist form of subjectivity, as its correlate. Foucault's provocation of the standard understanding of liberalism is thus the claim that the liberal subject is not in fact an atom of freedom in the face of all the conditions undertaking legislations and prohibitions of a possible government. Instead, he or she must be understood as a certain historically constructed type of the subject that corresponded to specific practices of subjection and enabled a new art of government to be developed according to the new principles of capitalist economies. The habits installed in this subject no longer aim to turn him or her primarily into a docile and efficient machine. They aim to construct him or her as a consumer and an entrepreneur. Quote, the surface of contact between the individual and the power exercised on him, and so the principle of the regulation of power over the individual, will be the grid of Homo economicus. Homo economicus is the interface of government and the individual, unquote. Foucault's genealogy of the Homo economicus begins with the British empiricists, Locke and Hume, and their philosophical accounts of the subject. What British empiricism introduces to Western philosophy for the first time, quote, is a subject who is not so much defined by his freedom or by the opposition of body and soul, but who appears in the form of a subject of individual choices, which are both irreducible and non-transferable, unquote. According to Foucault, the key notion of interest denotes the principle of an irreducible and non-transferable individual choice, and its emergence is the momentous rupture in Western thought. Foucault discusses a frequently cited passage from Hume's Inquiries in which he proposes that we ask a man why he uses exercise. the man would answer that he wants to keep his health. If he pushed the inquiry further and asked why he wants to keep his health, he would note that sickness is painful. However, he would not be able to answer the final question of why he hates pain. Foucault argues that for Hume, individual choice is therefore irreducible in a sense that it becomes a regressive endpoint in the analysis of human behavior. In political practice, Hume's thought signals the emergence of a subject of interest as the core correlate of the art of liberal government. The new capitalist subject was essentially a non-substitutable and irreducible atom of interest. He or she was essentially someone who always pursued his or her own interest and whose interest was such that it converged spontaneously with the interest of others. This did not mean the end of governmental interference, however. It necessitated a fundamental change in the rationality of governmental practice. Governmental action was now brought to bear on the rules of the game rather than on the players themselves. There was, quote, an environmental type of intervention instead of the internal subjugation of the individuals, unquote. Commentators have suggested that Foucault must have found the radical anti-humanism Foucault must have found the radical anti-humanism of the neoliberal analysis fascinating. Neoliberals such as Becker, there's definitely a paragraph missing here, but that's okay. There's a paragraph that somehow leads you from the liberal governmentality to the neoliberal governmentality. But I can elaborate on that in the discussion if that becomes necessary. Commentators have suggested that Foucault must have found the radical anti-humanism of the neoliberal analysis fascinating. Neoliberals such as Becker simply discarded the metaphysical and anthropological question of whether human beings really are naturally self-interested and competitive. The crucial and fundamental presupposition underlying the work of the Chicago School economists was that in order for us to be able to provide a rational explanation for economic mechanisms, we must treat human beings as if they were rational benefit maximizers. So the production of a new neoliberal subject would thus not be a consequence of neoliberalism's anthropological universalism, but its normative political ontology. The economic rationality must be the rationality of the entire society. Foucault argues that the Chicago School eliminated the difference between the social and the economic. It was characterized by its use of market economy analysis to decipher relationships and phenomena that were previously thought to belong not to the economic, but to the social or political realm. So economy was no longer one domain among others with its own particular rationality. It was understood as the rationality of the entirety of human action. This generalization of the economic form of the market to the whole of society functioned then effectively as a grid of intelligibility and a principle of decipherment for social relationships and individual behavior. As Andrew Dilts, for example, contends, the quote, the neoliberal analysts look out at the world and do not see discrete and identifiable firms, producers, households, consumers, mothers, fathers, criminals, or any other fixed category of human subjectivity. They see homini economici, responsive agents to the reality of costs and benefits attached to activities, each of which are productive of satisfaction. They see the eminently governable individuals who are the correlate of a governmentality which will act on the environment and systematically modify its variables. Unquote. So, if Foucault's message to us always was that there is no sovereign, universal and founding subject that one could find everywhere, today, in the world that neoliberal governmentality constructs, perhaps the capitalist subject has really become nothing but an empty form. It makes less and less difference anymore who one really is. The truth of the subject has become irrelevant. Capitalism couldn't care less about any enigmatic depth or tantalizing secrets that we may still insist on harboring. All that matters are the activities, the conducts, the accumulation of skills and qualities that make up our human capital and that allow for us to arrive at the self-understanding of those activities that produce most benefit for us. To briefly conclude, a neat way to encapsulate Foucault's disagreement with both psychoanalysis and Marxism would be to emphasize the single most important methodological principle that, according to him, characterized all his work. In an encyclopedia entry on Michel Foucault from 1984, which is generally believed to be written by Foucault himself, he makes a number of illuminative sum-ups about his work, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight. He singles out the study of the constitution of the subject as the unifying theme of all his studies, and notes that this has implied certain methodological choices, the most important one being the systematic skepticism with respect to all anthropological universals. He explains, quote, "This does not mean that anthropological universals are all rejected at the outset, only that nothing along those lines must be allowed if it is not rigorously indispensable. In the realm of our knowledge, everything presented to us as having universal validity, insofar as human nature or the categories that can be applied to the subject are concerned, has to be tested and analyzed. The first methodological rule for this sort of work is thus the following: to circumvent anthropological universals to the greatest extent possible, so as to interrogate them in their historical constitution," unquote. So it is my contention that Foucault's ultimate dissatisfaction with both psychoanalysis and Marxism concerns essentially their violations of this methodological principle. His problem is not only the obvious forms of essentialism, explicit assumptions concerning human beings, but what could be called methodological essentialism, the implicit, illegitimate generalizations that result in ahistorical and decontextualized accounts of the subject, erasing politically salient differences. The differing forms of capitalist subjectivity are always constituted through historical practices of subjection, and our critical analysis must target those practices. Thank you.
The floor is now open to questions, comments.
Thank you, Johanna, for that talk. I learned a lot. I have a very basic question with regards to Foucault. Does he have a concept of, you talked about his rejection of ideology, but does he have a concept of alienation?
Does he use the concept?
Does Foucault have an understanding of alienation? And if not, how does he differentiate humans from, let's say, animals? Like, so is there a distance between humans and the earth that's constitutive of human being?
As far as I know, there's no discussion of alienation, but I also think that the attempt to make some kind of theoretical distinction between humans and animals would require applying some heavy anthropological universals. I think it would be a very, in a sense, un-Foucauldian project to engage with. But I think a Foucauldian way to approach that problem, if one was to approach it, would be to study the ways that that distinction has been made, and the sort of practices and theorizations on which it relies. And in fact, I think there's some interesting work in this growing field of critical animal studies at the moment that use Foucault explicitly in quite interesting and exciting ways. And I think, you know, that would be perhaps the one, at least one of the ways to appropriate.
And just to follow up, thanks. If this is okay. So then, do you think it's unfair for some of like to accuse him of being, you know, it's understandable that he was tempted by game theory or rational choice theory in a certain sense, if humans are just sort of rats in this web of power. So what is the difference in a certain sense between, if he has no concept of alienation, not a differentiation between, let's say, humans and animals or humans and plants, etc. What differentiates him from, again, positive rational choice theorists? Or,
I think again this is a kind of a problematic way of putting the question, because it's not that Foucault has no concepts or theories or views on certain things, but I think his attempt is not to, in a sense, advocate an explicit theory of what subjects are like. So a rational choice theory would not be something, I mean, it would be something that he is interested in analyzing critically, and is interested in showing the ways that these neoliberal, very influential neoliberal conceptualizations are operative and influential in the ways that we've come to understand ourselves today. But it's not that he is, you know, explicitly against them or advocating them. He's simply trying to understand how it is that we have come to view ourselves and each other. Something like this.
Yeah. Foucault, when Foucault died, the Cold War was still in full swing, and the French Communist Party was still very powerful and had, let's say, a whole block of intellectuals. And what I wanted to know was, I have no idea, but what kind of dialogue took place with these intellectuals? For example, did the journal La Pensée or other ones, did they deal with him, and vice versa?
I'm not the right kind of Foucauldian to really answer this question, because I'm the sort of biographical details of Foucault, I'm not very good on those at all. Nor the kind of historical context. Of course, I've read stuff on this, but I have, you know, I'm the kind of Foucauldian who's, in fact, tried to little bit avoid that type of engagement, for the reason that I want to think of myself as a toolbox Foucauldian. You know, Foucault said that my work is a toolbox, and I want people to use it. I don't want you to repeat what I said. I don't want you to, you know, write books on me, which I have done, though I have to say that. But you know, so he sort of encouraged us to just take his ideas and do what we want with them. And this I think is what I've sort of tried to do. But of course, at the same time, of course, I recognize that it is important to understand the historical context and the political issues that were motivating him, and the theoretical debates that were happening at the time. But I can't provide a very detailed answer to that question, but it's a good question. Perhaps you can say something about it.
No, not at all, but I'm very grateful for your talk, because you're also a Marxist Foucauldian, or
right.
Reveal Foucault to have been a Marxist to the end. So I was just wondering.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I recently got very interested in Foucault's relationship to Marx, and I'm sorry that the paper really deals with that in much more detail than its relationship to psychoanalysis. But, and of course, one reason for this is that, one sort of contemporary reason for this is that there is so much sort of commentary literature now on Foucault's fascination with neoliberalism, even claims that he was a neoliberal. And this to me has seemed kind of crazy and a weird development, because I've always read him in connection with, you know, in connection with Marx's inheritance. Okay, it's not a very orthodox or faithful appropriation of Marx, but I think, you know, I've hopefully made clear that it's not a particularly hidden one either, and it's not that he doesn't make it explicit at, I think, in a number of instances.
Okay. Yeah, I have a very general question,
Sure.
and I'm curious what you think about it. It relates to the first part of your paper. Now, I think generally speaking, we have this idea of desire. That desire is a kind of force or will, you know, we want to do something, and that the law or power is what says no. You can't do everything you want, there are limits in life. That's the lesson of psychoanalysis, okay. Now, as you point out, Foucault quite correctly says Lacan's idea is more sophisticated.
Sure.
That the law is not something external to desire, but is internal to it. But still, we have to develop the more positive conception of power. That would be Foucault's breakthrough. Now, so my question is this: what if we reverse this picture and say, in fact, society, the law, power is always telling us what we should do and how we should do it, and it's desire that says no. And isn't that Lacan's, in a way, fundamental insight? Let me give it just a very simple, concrete example. When Lacan deals with like oral sexuality, what he says is it's not that the child has some kind of oral drive, it wants to eat, it wants to consume, to put something in its mouth, and the parent says, no, you can't do that. It's the opposite. The kind of basic scenario he imagines is the mother says, hey, you should eat now, and the child says, no, I'm not going to eat. I refuse your food. And in refusing food, even if the child's hungry, why does it do that? I mean, it even does that against its interests. It does that for one reason, to prove that the desire cannot be reduced to the social demand. And all desire is a break with the positive network of demands, which constitutes society. And the no, so the no in this instance, it's not coming from an agency, it's not coming from a subject that would say no, but the no is the subject. I mean, the subject is nothing other than its subtraction from the demand, to prove that its existence can't be saturated. And I wonder if we start from this standpoint, so it's desire that says no, not the law. And after all, you know, all of Lacan's examples are like this Antigone, or like the reading of Claudel, Signe de Coufontaine. In the end, her desire is just no, I can't participate in this game anymore. I wonder if we start from this picture of desire, then there would be an interesting dialogue with Foucault on this point. Because the problem I always have with Foucault, or what I don't understand is, does power saturate the social field or not? Are there gaps in power? Is resistance always telegraphed by power? Or is there a resistance that goes against power? For Lacan, in a way, this isn't the same problem. Because he starts from the idea that subjectivity is a break in the network of relations, positive demands, superego demands. But for Foucault, I feel like it's a more murky question. So that's just my, what if we started from a different starting point than Foucault does, who still reproduces that rather commonsensical idea that desire is, I want to do something, and the power says, no, you can't.
Thanks, Aaron. I take your point, but I don't think that Foucault, I don't think that is Foucault's, I don't think Foucault operates with such a simple understanding of desire, and I think that's why that lecture is important, where he actually recognizes Lacan, and he recognizes that desire is not simply this desire to do something that power then represses. But I think that, I guess my objection or concern or something to your argument would then be that even if we understand desire in this more complex way, it is still in that framework understood as something that rises up against power. So the idea that Foucault is in a sense ridiculing in History of Sexuality is this idea that there's something liberating in sexuality, that there's something that says no to power, that is kind of a basis of resistance, and that this is the kind of trap, that by saying yes to sex, we say no to power. And I don't think, even if we sort of complicate our understanding of desire, we get away from this model. But of course, this is maybe we do. But I'm just saying that in itself would not solve the problem. But of course, then I recognize the thing that you will then say to me, and the thing that all critics of Foucault will always say, well, what about resistance then? How do we understand resistance? With this type of framework, there's no place for resistance. If it's not the desiring subject that can stand up to desire, can stand up to societal power, then what can? Now, I think this is a long discussion, and I think we will have this presumably, probably in different forms for the next 3 days. So I'm not trying to preempt it here, and I think it's not this, as you say, a simple question, how to theorize resistance in Foucault. But I certainly think, and this is something that I have written on, that there are different ways of conceptualizing it, especially if we take into account his late work. So there is the idea of bodies and pleasures, and then there is the idea of practices of the self, where he attempts to deal with this question. And of course, there is a kind of a refinement of his theory of power too. As you say, so his understanding of power is something that sort of develops and gets more refined through his work. And I think you're right that when he begins his theorization of power, it is unclear, what if there are any gaps in power, like what does it mean to resist power? And I think as we get a more sophisticated understanding of power, it becomes clearer.
I have a question here. Since you finished your paper with Foucault's call for history, I'm wondering if you could elaborate more on his concept of history. In a sense, can we still talk about history? There is no sort of a dialectical, historical logic binding practices.
I think to make some very big summary type points, I guess Foucault's point all through his work is in some ways to argue against the kind of a teleological understanding of history, some kind of a big story that emerges. But I think that, of course, doesn't mean that we can't identify some kind of deep structures or rationalities behind historical developments. I mean, this whole project would be pointless if we couldn't. So yes and no, perhaps, would be the answer to that. I think in some ways he, if anything, he's showing us the importance of history, but of course history understood in a very specific way.
Yeah. I want to ask you not the usual question, where is resistance in Foucault? I want to ask you, where is value? Value is very important in Marx, and I think you've given a very persuasive account of how Foucault's theory of power could be seen as an elaboration and an historical specification of Marx's project, because power is both repressive and productive. But you haven't yet said what is produced by the productive aspect of power that might differentiate capitalism from all of the other practices which many Foucaultians, not yourself, regard as analogous to capitalism because they also involve power that is both repressive and productive. I don't want to say that Foucault is simply describing the how of Marxism and rejecting the why in a teleological sense. Capitalism exists. But I think the question of value, and particularly the vehicles of its accumulation, are part of what many of us who are Marxists regard as the real of capitalism that drops out in a Foucauldian account. And I'd like to address that.
That's an excellent question, and that would be one way to perhaps crystallize some of the differences. But of course, only in a speculative way, because Foucault doesn't, himself answer your question. So we can only, suggest different type of answers. I think, and I can imagine at least two. One would be, so by value you refer to labor theory of value in some ways.
Well, not necessarily, but
A kind of a Marxist understanding of value.
it could also be a theory of financial valuation, as I'll try to argue tomorrow. But it could be the labor theory of value.
Okay, but let's just take, because this is kind of the standard understanding of Marxist understanding of value, the labor theory of value. I think this is a great question in a sense that it of course brings to focus the question of universalism and sort of anthropological universals in some ways. I mean, one way to answer it would be to say that if we want to insist on a kind of a Marxist Foucault, we could say that, okay, he assumes labor theory of value as underlying capitalist production, but of course his understanding of what power produces is in some sense broader. That the Marxist analysis focuses on the sort of economic logic of production, whereas the Foucauldian idea would somehow encompass all types of practices, even practices that would not be relevant for Marxist analysis or interesting or something like that. And the other way to answer would be to say that, and I guess this is a common, in some ways a common criticism of Marxism, is that this is an unfounded assumption that underlies the theory, and that we don't need it, strictly speaking. So the other way would be to read him as a Marxist that does not commit to the labor theory of value. I don't know if, but as I said, there is no right answer to this. This is just, one could construct different speculative scenarios here of what the Foucauldian Marxist would say to this question.
Thank you very much for your talk. Actually, I have a kind of, just occurred to me when you described how this neoliberal, when they look from out of the window, what they see, they don't see any subjects troubled with their deep secrets, they just see these agencies involved in different practices that are going on and so on. But it's not this very description dream come through for Foucault. This is precisely what he wants to see when he looks from the window. I mean, it's just agencies involved in different practices that structure on this local level. And I think this is precisely the problem. There is a certain, I would say, affinity between neoliberalism and Foucault, in the sense that I think, although of course he was the first to recognize this mode of functioning, but it is also very interesting, and a colleague of mine actually pointed this out in a recent paper, how if you look at his analysis of neoliberalism, it is almost the only instance in Foucault's work where he actually takes their word for it. I mean, the way he analyzes neoliberal theory, he just believes them. It's not that, as if the reality, I mean, there is a point there, as if there is a certain real there that then one, it's a different approach or a different kind of take on the, so I don't know, perhaps I think that we should complicate a bit further this story that I also adhere to some extent that, okay, capitalism doesn't give a damn about our inner depth and so on, this for sure. But I wonder if this is the anti-humanist stance. I'm not sure if this is not just the flip side or the other side of humanism. I mean, that there is this kind of complicity between this supposedly nothing really matters, because there is something that nevertheless I think does matter. And that we should not perhaps stop our analysis too short and say, okay, now nothing matters anymore. I think we should probably try to find points that still do matter in some, okay, this is an abstract argument, but
no, I definitely think we should find things that matter, you know, and I think Foucault believes that we need to find things that matter. This is why he engages in, you know, years of work on practices of the self and so on after these analyses. So I don't think, I mean, this discussion of Foucault as a neoliberal, I really don't see it. I mean, okay, he analyzes these texts of neoliberals supposedly in some other way than other texts. But if you read Discipline and Punish, he takes these people seriously too. He takes seriously, you know, Bentham, and he takes seriously all these prison reformers. He doesn't, you know, take some kind of an external standpoint where he pronounces judgments on them. And yet, to read Discipline and Punish and not see it as a critique is somehow to miss the point of the book. I think similarly to read his description of neoliberalism, it's not that he thinks that this is great, you know, I will now advocate this, and it's not that he sort of steps outside and judges it somehow. But again, I think there is a definite style in those lectures. If you read those lectures, he doesn't produce any sort of judgments, but for example, some of the examples that he gives from Becker, the mother investing time in her child. I mean, these are quite outrageous examples that he picks out to try and show us what this type of rationality, where this type of rationality leads to. So I personally read them not as him somehow thinking that these people are right, but him trying to show us what kind of governmentality we are entering into and what kinds of extremes it will take us if we follow it through. Now secondly, the other question, isn't this empty subject a dream come true for Foucault? I mean, in certain respects, yes. In certain respects it is. But I don't think he is studying it to show us that, hey, this is how we should all think. You know, Becker is right. I think he is, in a sense, I don't know if he is even, I mean, I would argue that the way that this subject has become empty is seriously problematic for him, and that's why he needs to engage in this long study of the practices of the self. But if you think of the reasons why anthropological universals for him are dangerous, then I think it would be fair to say that with all its problems and all its reductive views of the subject and excessive emphasis on economic rationality, at least what the problem is not in the neoliberal subject is this kind of normalizing assumptions about human beings. So yes, I would imagine that Foucault, this small aspect of it, Foucault would somehow see as perhaps positive. But I don't think that this is certainly not a dream come true for him. And if you read his late work carefully, I think that makes it very clear.
Lorenzo, and then
Ira had a long time ago.
Sorry.
Thanks, Johanna. one of the things that's sort of striking to me in the context of a conversation with Foucault and Lacan is the way in which it kind of keeps coming back up, this question of but resistance, but when the Foucauldian perspective doesn't substantivize power, as you know, as Nicola and Robert both kind of noted at the end of the last session, right? So there's this sense in which if Foucault's not substantivizing power, then resistance to power, meh, to some extent, meh. You know, it's not substantivized in the same way that le nom du père is. That's a real thing. That's a substantial ontological fact in a sense. Whereas power is a heuristic or an analytic that gets you a way of thinking about a lot of different practices. So I'm not super sympathetic to that critique, but I do actually kind of want to press you a little bit on the question that I took Robert and Alenka to be asking in two different veins, which is you still have to have a way of articulating why some things are better than other things. And I think you sort of spoke to that at the nexus of normalization and normation. And I actually wanted to know if you'd just expand a little bit on normalization versus normation, and where exactly, what kind of matrix they set up.
Sure. No, because you know there are just these reoccurring questions that Foucauldians have to answer, and that's fine. But there used to be always the Habermasian question. So what's the normative grounding for all this? How is resistance possible? But now they've become this neoliberalism question. So wasn't Foucault a neoliberal? You know, isn't he agreeing with Becker? So so I'm not going to go into the full debate with Habermas. Let's just say something about, I mean, I don't mean just Habermas, but the whole massive discussion about the normative, what are the normative foundations and what is the framework of critique here. I think the normalization distinction is interesting because if the norm is derived from scientific average, then of course it looks, at least supposedly, normatively neutral. It is simply an empirical average or an empirical fact. And I think this is an important contribution from Foucault to, in a sense, question the way that norms, question the way that scientific truths are masquerading, that norms are masquerading as scientific truths. And this, of course, is something that that characterizes a lot of the political problems and political critiques of today. So I think there Foucault has really sort of done something important, and there I think is one point where the distinction, that the problems with the notion of ideology become visible. And Foucault's, in a sense, innovations in political critique are important.
Thank you, Joanna. I was wondering what you make of Foucault's take on class struggle and the proletariat as a Foucauldian reading Foucault also through Marx, because though I'm totally sympathetic to what Alenka said, that is to say, I do myself believe that that picture, neoliberal vignette you delineated, could be short-circuited, maybe unwittingly in your understanding with Foucault. So I do think that, you know, like the care of the self, the last Foucault can be seen as somehow dialoguing with neoliberalism, even though critically. But on the other hand, and I'm referring specifically about to the dialogue with Chomsky, Foucault may also, and this is clearly an oversimplification, come through as a staunch Marxist. You know, remember the power versus justice opposition with the very anarcho-syndicalist Chomsky of the time, saying we should derail trains supplying arms for Vietnam, etc., etc. But when it comes to class, I think Foucault insists 3 times, asking Chomsky, well, but okay, we disagree. I think it's all a matter of power. You think it's a matter of justice, and he goes on saying even like justifying violence in the terms of a new class emerging and seizing power as the key issue, where instead justice is secondary for Foucault. But Foucault would seem, from the standpoint of today, not only much more Marxist than Chomsky, but actually you would find today himself in a difficult position to defend those categories from a very orthodox Marxist position. You know, think about also like, say, Zizek or Negri when it comes to accounting in a very general discussion, what do you make of the proletariat today, 2015? They have to come up with a circumvented answer and they have to create something new. Foucault, in that dialogue, 1971, seems to be not only not renouncing to the notions of class struggle and the proletariat, but also to be totally okay with them. So I was, after Alenka's question, you know, like, it seems to me, as a non-Foucauldian, a lot of interest a non-Foucauldian may have in Foucault is precisely because of this radical oscillation. So the almost ultra-Leninist Foucault, of course, not in terms of universal but of power, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Foucault that Alenka was delineating. I think this is fascinating. The question was, what is your take on class struggle and proletariat according to Foucault?
I mean, first of all, the 2 Foucaults that you're talking about, the Foucault in the early 70s and the Foucault and the late Foucault, you know, this is quite a long period of time, and a lot has happened, not just politically in the world, but also in terms of Foucault's own theoretical trajectory. So, and a lot has happened in terms of the fortunes of Marxism in that time. Now, back to the neoliberalism question. Once again, I fully agree with both of you that Foucault's late work dialogues, as you said, with neoliberalism, because it should do. I mean, if it is going to be a politically meaningful contribution to his own time in the 1980s, then it should critically engage with neoliberalism. This is, I think, what it should do. So if you see some critical dialoguing or affinity or something like that, then I think good. I think then it's doing what it should do. Because of course it's not that the attempts to imagine forms of resistance can happen in some historical vacuum. They have to be reactions to their time. And of course, in a sense, the early 70s Foucault, again, is reacting to the struggles of his time at that point. There, you know, the problem is not neoliberal governmentality or homo economicus or something like this. So there, the role of class struggle and the role of the proletariat as a form of subjectivity that could somehow take the role of political resistance against capitalism is very different, I think. So no one position, in a sense, can be taken to this question.
Another question in the same direction. First of all, thanks for your paper and thanks for your patience with our skeptical.
Sorry if I seem impatient.
No, for you.
And I certainly hope that I'm
No,
the only person.
It's lunchtime almost.
That is having to defend Foucault. Okay.
It's a question about the consolidation of Marx and Foucault. And could we not allow, if I think a bit further speculatively in your direction also, in the direction of the comment that Robert made, that let's see it more as a parallax. in Foucault, there are certain theoretical objects produced that cannot be translated into Marx. And should we not just agree and also affirm the discontinuity to not lose the interesting parts in both? So I can see sometimes there's a synthesis, sometimes parallelism, but there's a deep rupture, you can say, even though there are no ruptures in Foucault. But one point is really the theory of value. If you think that in the midst of the nominalism of money, we find the universalism, the actually really existing universals of the value, something like real abstraction, you cannot translate into Foucault. And symptomatically, he mistook actually Marx for Ricardo, if you look at the reading. So why not just dismiss this and not just say, okay, we cannot translate it into a Marxian language and vice versa, but this is the strength. So rather than, pushing you further and give me a Foucaultian answer for some theoretical object that doesn't exist in this universe, I would just say, okay, for sure. If we live in capitalism, we have a discontinuity to a different discourse. It's Marx's discovery of the value form and of something like real abstraction. I don't have to believe in universals, I have it in my pocket as a coin.
Excellent. This is the answer I should have given you. It's pointless to make this, it's pointless to speculate, but sometimes it's fun, of course. I mean, if we take that line, we might as well all go home now, because, trying to relate Foucault and Lacan is, in a sense, a very similar problem, that, it requires moving to a completely different theoretical framework and trying to make sense of that, and in a sense try to see what it would look like through a very different vocabulary and framework. But I certainly don't want anyone to get the impression that I was trying to argue that Foucault was simply somehow continuing Marx's analysis. I think there are significant differences there, and I think there are, in a sense, significant innovations from Foucault's part, but also important affinities and important sort of common lines of inquiry. But yeah, thanks for your contribution. Good.
Well, Faris, I mean, can you keep it very short? Because thanks.
Just to continue on that, can we consider that Marx could be a fiction, which means a bunch of universals that are criticized by Foucault, and a fiction that empowers capitalism in the same way as the philanthropist or the humanitarian or these discourses empowers what they criticize through their failures?
That's an interesting suggestion, but I think it would, in a sense, not take us very far. I think we would then have to, in a sense, develop what it is that in Marxism allows capitalism to somehow appropriate it uncritically.
With the macro categories.
Okay.
Through their opposition, which replaces micro differences.
Okay, through a kind of a narrative of big...
of the emancipation, etc. And this way the micro politics become invisible and they propagate.
But I think that the reading of Marx that Foucault puts forward in that lecture, The Mesh of Power, he reads Marx as especially paying attention to these micro practices. So if we read Marx carefully, we are not dealing with some kind of big abstract categories, but he is the theoretician of, in a sense, these micropolitics.
This is what he took from Marx. He focused on that rather than on value and economics and class struggle, which is the official Marxist discourse.
Exactly.
And I think it's not that he's realizing Marx or he's implementing Marx, but a possibility would be that he's criticizing Marxism in this sense.
Yes, for sure. He's criticizing some readings of Marx by putting forward a different reading. I think this is clear. Because if you defend a kind of an unorthodox reading, of course, that is invertedly a critique of the more orthodox reading.
I shall take my prerogative as chair of this session to end it now. Please join me in a great round of applause.